the education and the spiritual formation of children, youth, and adults is why the church exists. We're here to make and mature disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And if we're not teaching, if we're not keeping those people we're charged to teach safe, then there's really not a reason for us to be here. What I'm going to present to you is basically highlights or common themes that happen when local churches do a Safe Sanctuaries policy and update it. We're the conference, and the job of the annual conference is to provide resources for you so that you as a local congregation can decide what your Safe Sanctuary policy needs to include and not include, and that's basically the gist of what that's all about. We all know we're here to protect our children. We all know we're also here to protect the workers. Sometimes we forget about that. But a good Safe Sanctuaries policy and guidelines will protect the people who are working with children, youth, and vulnerable adults also. And third, it's to protect this church and the ministry that it has in this community where it's been placed. Our goal is to share Christ with this community, and we can't do that if people won't come here and we're not keeping people safe. Scripture is loaded with examples of why we should be doing what we're doing. Okay, Micah 6:8, but he has already made it plain for you how to live and what to do, what God is looking for in men and women. It's quite simple. Do what is fair and just to your neighbor, be compassionate and loyal in your love, and don't take yourself too seriously. Take God very seriously. That's the Message translation. But in there, the most important piece for us is to do justice. And to do justice by the children, youth, and vulnerable adults in our congregation is to make sure that they're protected and safe, because they're not able to do that for themselves in a lot of cases. Second one, anyone know what Matthew 18:5 is? This is, Jesus called a little child to come in front of him. You must change your thinking and become like this little child. If you don't do this, you will never enter God's kingdom. The greatest person in God's kingdom is the one who makes himself humble like this child. In a culture where children were, the disciples wanted to shoo them away and keep them away, Jesus said, no, they're the most important. Bring them here to the center. And I'm going to use them as the example of what you're supposed to be. In Ecclesiastes, this one really speaks to the core of the procedures or guidelines we follow with Safe Sanctuaries. Basically, if one person falls, the other person can reach out and help. But those who are alone, when they fall, they have no one to help them. If two people sleep together, they will be warm. But a person sleeping alone will not be warm. An enemy might be able to defeat one person, but two people can stand back to back and defend each other. And three people are even stronger. They are like a rope that has three parts wrapped together. It's very hard to break. The basis of Safe Sanctuaries is that you're never alone with a child, youth, or vulnerable person. And that scripture illustrates that for us very well. The baptismal covenant we give when we baptize a child and we all stand up and read out of the hymnal, this is the promise that we make. And part of that promise is not just to set an example and surround them with love, but we're going to protect them. We can't share Christ with them if they're not in a safe place. Okay, so we make that commitment for every child that comes here and is baptized. The social principles of the United Methodist Church. These go hand in hand with our Book of Discipline, and they're updated every 4 years at General Conference. And this particular one I really like because it's very clear. The social principles of the United Methodist Church are explicit about protecting our children. In particular, children must be protected from economic, physical, emotional, and sexual exploitation and abuse. Kind of cuts right through. And in 1996, the General Conference adopted a resolution that said every church should have a child protection policy. Now, over the years, we've changed it to Safe Sanctuaries, and that actually is a trademark logo in the Methodist Church. Joy Melton, who is a deacon ordained in the United Methodist Church, her deacon role in the church is as a lawyer. She's ordained as a deacon and she's a lawyer. And her passion and what she has gifted the church with is that she has spent her career working on child protection policies and how that protects and how that helps with ministry in the local church. There are 3 books that I have where we refer to them. Safe Sanctuaries, Reducing the Risk of Abuse in the Church for Children and Youth. Most of the policies that we're talking about find their root in her book and in her samples, the conference and most local churches. And then, because times have changed, Safe Sanctuaries in a Virtual World, meaning we have social media and all that stuff in our pocket. And then the third piece that she added, the third book, is The Church Responds to Abuse, Neglect, and Exploitation of Older Adults. Most of the original policies talked about children or children and youth. And so what she added, or what they've added over the years that local churches need to add to their policy and wrestle with, is the piece about social media and the piece about vulnerable adults. Statistics. These are from her Safe Sanctuaries book. The National Center for Child Abuse and Neglect report that 3 million incidents of physical abuse and or neglect per year are reported in the United States. There's a lot more than that go unreported. 1 out of 7 boys and 1 out of 3 girls will be sexually assaulted in their childhood. So if you think about that 3 million, this kind of brings it home. That's 8,219 children, youth, are abused each day. 343 children or youth are abused each hour. Close to 6 children or youth are abused per minute, or 1 child or youth is abused every 10 seconds. So it does happen. We can't turn our eyes away from it. There are people who sit in our midst who that was the reality in their childhood or when they were a youth. So the problem of abuse cuts across all economic, cultural, and racial lines. And I have a quote that I just want to share with you. I'm just going to read it because it's a really good quote. Tragically, churches have not always been safe places for children. Child sexual abuse, exploitation, and ritual abuse occurs in churches, large and small, urban and rural. The problem cuts across all economic, cultural, and racial lines. It is real, and it appears to be increasing. Many annual conferences can cite specific incidents of child sexual abuse and exploitation in their churches. Virtually every congregation has among its members adult survivors of early sexual trauma. Such incidents are devastating to all who are involved: the child, the family, the local church, and its leaders. Increasingly, churches are torn apart by legal, emotional, and monetary consequences of litigation following allegations of abuse. That kind of sums it up pretty well. And that's why we're here doing what we're doing, so that doesn't happen at this church. And that's why I do what I do for the conference, so that we try to have that not happen in any of our churches in East Ohio. There are annual conferences. I've heard the stories. Some annual conferences have very elaborate processes in the annual conference for screening people and training people because they were victims. The conference became named in a lawsuit, and they lost their shirt. So to protect themselves, they now have very elaborate processes in place. And there's a particular church I heard the story from very recently where litigation happened because there was an allegation and abuse happened. And the local church had insurance, like it should, but the award that they were given to the victim was greater than what was covered by the insurance. And so they were on the hook for that amount of money. And what ends up happening in a lawsuit with these kinds of things, they don't just name the local congregation. They name the district, they name the conference, because we're a connectional system. We're all connected to each other. So why are we talking about this in the church? One, because we're a trusting organization. We come in the door, we send our kids off with other adults in the church. We may go somewhere else. We're not there with our kids all the time, but we trust the people who are leading our ministries in the church with children, youth, and vulnerable adults. Second, we may think it's not important to do that because that would never happen here. And so because of that, we don't do applications, we don't check references, we may not run background checks, because that won't happen here. And I'm sure the other places where it has happened, they had that same thought. It would never happen here. And last, we provide those opportunities for close contact and relationship building with children, youth, and vulnerable adults. And the answer isn't, let's just not put people in that position. Because how do people come to know Christ? You're allowed to jump in there if you want. It's through those relationships. There's probably someone in your life, a significant person who shared Christ with you because you were friends with them. It could be a family member, it could be a youth leader, a Sunday school teacher, but someone in your life in a relationship shared Christ with you. And so we don't want to turn our backs to that. We just want to make sure that we do it in a safe way. So a couple definitions that are part of the conference policy to help us understand where we're heading. A vulnerable person, what we did when we updated the conference policy, what the suggestions were is that you say children, youth, and vulnerable adults. So what we did is we combined those together and we say vulnerable persons. And when we say vulnerable persons, we're talking about children, youth, and vulnerable adults. The definition for vulnerable adults is included there. An adult whose behavior indicates that he or she is mentally or emotionally incapable of adequately caring for himself or herself and his or her interest without adverse consequences to himself or herself or others, or who, because of physical or mental impairment, is unable to protect themselves from abuse, neglect, exploitation, sexual abuse, or emotional abuse by others. Okay? That's the new definition, that's the new piece that we're challenged to include in our policies. An adult, for the intent of talking about safe sanctuaries, an adult's at least 18 years of age, and the guideline is usually 5 years older than the people that they're helping. So if someone is helping with younger children, the guideline we try to follow is that they're 5 years older than the people that they're working with. And there are some particular situations that gets hairy around is when we're talking about youth ministry. A lot of times when we want to hire a new youth director, we want to hire someone who's young like the youth and they're just out of college, and so we hire someone who's 21 or 22 years old. But then they can be working with 18-year-olds who are still in high school. And that difference is not really enough difference. Someone who's 21 or 22 may not be cognitively developed enough to understand the ramifications of their actions in the future. And there have been incidents I've been called in to talk about and to offer advice on where that has been an issue. Because at 21 and 22, you're also still a raging hormone. Excuse my French. And so that 18-year-old, you may feel like that maturity, you're the same level. And so it's hard to draw boundaries. I'm not saying you can't hire that person, but you need to make sure you have guidelines and procedures for how those interactions happen. Safe sanctuaries, I think we all know what this is all about, so I'm not going to read that to you. Let's move on. The other piece that we need to understand is what really is child abuse. And Ohio state law and the revised code defines child abuse this way. Engaging in any sexual activity with a child as defined by Chapter 2907 of the Ohio Revised Code, endangering a child as defined in 2919.22 of the Ohio Revised Code. We're going to get to that. But what it is denial as means of punishment of proper or necessary sustenance, education, medical care, or other care necessary to a child for the child's health. Use of restraint procedures on a child that cause injury or pain, or administration of prescription drugs to a child without written approval by a physician and supervision by a physician, providing alcohol or controlled substances to a child, commission of intentional acts that result in injury or death, infliction of physical or mental injury that threatens to harm a child's health, welfare, or safety. That's child abuse. Now, if we keep going, child endangerment really just kind of takes that a little bit further. It's abuse, torture, or cruel abuse, corporal punishment, or other physical discipline, physical restraint that's excessive under the circumstances which could injure a child, repeated uncalled for discipline which, if continued, would impair the child's mental health or their development, involving a child in any obscene, sexually oriented, or nudity-oriented activity or conduct. Keep going. So that's officially from the Ohio State Code what child abuse is, and we need to be aware of that. So the basis of Safe Sanctuaries is that we select and screen the right people and train them, and then we have guidelines that we follow. So selection and screening usually includes these pieces. Some churches don't do all these pieces. Some churches add more. But these are the basics. We have a written application. Reference checks. We do check references to find out that you are on the up and up, that there are people in your life that will give you a good reference so that you can do this. We do those two pieces because they're the first roadblock. If someone comes into your community and says, I want to have access to children because I have ill intent, where they're going to go? They're going to go to a church. Oh, I'll be a Sunday school teacher. I would love to work with your after-school program. And if you put roadblocks in their way, they may go to the next church down the road, or you may keep your children safe by asking for an application, by asking for people who will give them a good reference so that they can serve. Okay. Driver's license checks. If you're going to have anyone transporting vulnerable persons on behalf of your church, it's best to have a driver's license check. It's a good thing to do if they're going to be on your behalf as a church, transporting someone. Personal interviews. Most policies say if during the application and reference check there's a red flag, we want to do a personal interview. I can sit for hours and tool over what I'm going to put on my application so I sound really good. But when I sit down with you face to face and I'm looking you in the face, it's another roadblock to keep people from who are trying to get into your church, trying to get access to children who have ill intent from getting there. If you're going to run a background check, it's always good to say, no, am I going to find anything on this background check that we need to have conversation about before I do this? And it gives them the opportunity to say, well, 10 years ago, this happened. I got caught passing bad checks. That's an example of one that's come back. Things like that. And so it gives you the opportunity to ask those questions and have that conversation before you run the background check. And you can decide if that should preclude somebody from serving. A lot of times, the ones that do come back with something, it's before they knew Christ. They were people who were living a hard life. They've had a rough life, but then they met Christ, and now they're on fire for Jesus. And so that was a different life. They were a different person. They've been transformed by Christ. 6-month hospitality rule. Some churches make this a year. Some churches make it 3 months. But the idea is that people can't walk in the door this week and meet you, and you don't put them in charge of children, youth, and vulnerable adults the next week because you're desperate for teachers or they're anxious. This way, you've known them for 6 months or however long. They've been a regular attender in worship. You've gotten to know them in other activities and Bible studies, and you know that their heart's in the right place. And you don't know that if they just walk in the door. That way, they've been part of our fellowship for a while. Social media covenant. Social media has become a part of almost everyone's life. And so, we have to practice safe sanctuaries here as well as when we're face to face. And then criminal background checks. Some churches decide to do them randomly. The church where I worship, Faith in North Canton, they started several years ago running a background check on everybody. So before you are put in place, you have a background check run. Other churches, it's not something they're able to pull off on everybody. And so they reserve the right. It's in their policy. We reserve the right to run a criminal background check on you. And really, it's if during this process a red flag comes up and you want to run it. Or it's somebody new who hasn't really been here very long and we don't know them very well. It's a deterrent. Again, to put another roadblock in the way from people who have ill intent. So that's the screening side, and that's really important. I think from my perspective, the more important part is this procedures or guidelines side. Because even if someone gets through our screening process who has ill intent or has the the desire to do something with a child that we don't like, if we follow our policies, that can't happen, or our procedures. So most policies talk about two unrelated, non-cohabitating adults in every situation where there's teaching. The unrelated, non-cohabitating is the new part that Melanie Gordon brought to us at the training we did back in September. Really, that's for lawsuit purposes. If something does happen and there's a lawsuit, you can't testify against your spouse. And nowadays, because people cohabitate for so long, they become as husband and wife in the eyes of the law. That's the next step for that. So that isn't able to happen everywhere. I've been to churches where their best teaching teams are husbands and wives. And so what they do, and what Brotherhood Mutual's legal department, who's the conference legal department, when they sent our policy back, said, we want you to talk about the rule of three in your policy, which means when you don't have, that there's never a situation where there's an adult and a child alone, for one, okay? That's what we're trying to avoid, is an adult and a vulnerable person being alone. So if for some reason you have two non-related or two related people serving, or you only can have one teacher. There's that Sunday where the co-teacher didn't show up. That we have, they like to call it a premises monitor. And it's someone who kind of wanders around and sticks their head in randomly into those classrooms so that they can be that second adult. They can help take a kid to the restroom. They're being eyes and they're being that second adult. Our goal is always the two adults in every room, but when that can't happen, we want to make sure there's not one adult and one kid together, or vulnerable person, and that there's somebody checking in those rooms where there is those kind of situations that we don't want, that we're trying to avoid. Restroom guidelines. We never had restroom guidelines in the conference sample policy. I never saw them in local church policies. But we took the sample we wrote, the committee from the conference, and sent it to Brotherhood and their legal department, and they came back and said one of the areas where we have to litigate in local churches that we cover is restrooms. So please put procedures in here so that churches wrestle with this and figure out good ways to make sure kids can get back and forth to the restroom and they're safe. So you have to figure out for you how that works. Where are your children's classrooms? Where are the bathrooms? How do we get kids back and forth safely and continue to supervise? There's a very elaborate process in the sample policy, which is what they ask us to do, but you have to figure that out for your situation. The key there is no child is ever left unsupervised. So if you end up in a situation, this is the question I always get asked, well, we only had one kid show up for Sunday school. Well, let's make sure that we're following the rule of three. There's two adults and one child, or two children and one adult with a premises monitor, or find a way to make it work, add them to another classroom, and that adult goes with them so that there's an adult who can help with that different age child. But find a way to do that so it's never one-on-one. We talked about the 5 years older rule before when I talked about definitions and why we do that. Kind of carry over from the old policy is the open door counseling. When you're going to meet with a child or children, youth, or a vulnerable adult, you find a way to do that safely. From a pastoral standpoint, you know, you're called to be a counselor at times. People want to sit and talk to you about the troubles they have. But you want to do that. You don't want to run in the pastor's office and shut the door that doesn't have the window and be all, you know, hidden away. You want to make sure people know you're doing it and do it in a way where maybe you can be seen and not heard, so you protect privacy and confidentiality. First aid and CPR. Some people put in their policy that whenever we have a gathering that includes children, youth, or vulnerable adults, we're going to have someone who has first aid training and CPR training. That's hard to pull off in a lot of places. So they don't put it in there because they can't pull it off, but it can be a guideline that you try to follow, okay? And always know where first aid supplies are available when you're gathered. Participation covenant, that means that after you've been trained in safe sanctuaries, that you sign a covenant saying that, yeah, I'm going to follow it. Annual orientation for workers. Most policies say that annually we're going to meet and remind you of what our policy and procedures are all about. We may educate you on certain areas of development and discipline in the classroom and things like that. Those are all things that are usually included in that annual training. Advance notice to parents means that we're not going to do anything the parents aren't aware of. Some policies put it right in there that parents can come and show up and sit in at any point in time. Because we're not going to do anything, this is physically, we're not going to take them off somewhere to play putt-putt or whatever without the parents knowing and without a permission slip for that. But also it comes back to teaching. We're not going to teach something that can be controversial without parents knowing, because sometimes parents want to be the ones who teach their kids about human sexuality, about certain things like that, and so you want to make sure everybody knows, to keep everybody safe and to make sure parents know what's going on. Parent and family education, it's very important to let everybody know what your guidelines are for safe sanctuaries and why you do it. That way it makes it much easier for you to follow it if everybody's aware of what you do. The culture nowadays, people know what happens. They've heard the stories, they all hear it, they see it on Facebook and wherever on social media, so they know what to look for and they're looking for a place where their kids are safe. Social media. Basically, the social media sample policy in the conference is so that all those same things we just talked about take place when you're doing interactions online. Basically, the idea with Safe Sanctuaries, some of the basic guidelines are you want to follow the 2-adult rule. So if you're going to have interaction with somebody on Facebook or social media or Messenger or email, you as the adult are going to make sure you draw another adult into the conversation, whether that's parents, someone from the church, your Sunday school superintendent, whatever different roles you have. But if you as a leader are going to have conversation with a vulnerable person, you want to make sure someone else is in that conversation. So you invite them in, you include them, when you respond, you just add their name, you carbon copy them in if it's email or whatever, so that there's somebody else watching and it protects you and it protects them, okay? Whatever that social media context is. The other thing you got to watch is social media is not the place to do counseling and to have real conversations about tough topics. It may be the place where it starts because that's how generations now are communicating. But we know Christ is shared through relationships, and having a face-to-face conversation with someone is the way that we can read people and we can understand better how we're helping and how we're not helping. The other big area that has become a big issue is sharing people's pictures and information online. Most churches have policies that say you cannot share photos on Facebook or wherever. Facebook is a great marketing tool for your church, but the idea of just snapping pictures and putting them out there online can get you in a lot of trouble. You just have to protect people. There are families now who just don't want their kids' pictures online because they're fearful of things they've heard and they just don't want it. So you have to be careful. The third piece in social media is about connecting with people, with vulnerable persons. The rule of thumb is that if a vulnerable person connects with you and says, will you please be my friend, or whatever, connection on social media, I'm using Facebook terms because it's the most common, you can do that. But the rule is if you're the teacher, the leader, the pastor, you don't seek out people. They seek you. And the reason behind that as a rule is there are cases, if you read the book, Joy Melton's book, she gives some pretty graphic cases in instances where social media has been used to solicit an inappropriate relationship with a youth. We'll put it that way. And so this way, it's not the youth leader, it's not the pastor, it's not the teacher seeking the relationship with the kid, it's them seeking you. And then the same rules apply if you're going to be on Facebook with a vulnerable person. Watch what you post because you may be that relationship sharing Jesus with them. And if you're going to post things that you're doing that may not be edifying to Christ, then you don't post those things and you don't friend that person. The other thing is that, again, you make sure in those relationships, if there's correspondence that starts happening between you and that vulnerable person, that you include other people in the conversation. Okay? That's the gist of what a social media policy, the one for the conference, has in it. The other suggestion is always have 2 administrators of the church Facebook page or whatever. If I'm the only Facebook administrator and I leave, you've just lost your Facebook, because I'm the one with the login information and such. So it's that 2 adult rule again. It's the way to protect yourself. They're the second adult watching your Facebook account. The other piece that happens that we're challenged to educate by, the media has been full of instances in the last few years where bullying has happened, but nowadays bullying isn't being picked on the playground. Bullying happens through social media. And this stuff never goes away, and the audience is a whole lot bigger. And people who are vulnerable persons a lot of times don't have the skills to deal with that kind of bullying on that kind of scale, and it leads to suicide. We've heard the stories, we've seen it. So our task as the church is to protect people. Educating the congregation about your policy, particularly about social media, is critical. If you're going to have a policy about posting pictures, you have to let all your teachers know that. And some people just, but it was so cute, and it was my grandson, and so I posted it on my wall. Well, your grandson was in class with 3 other kids you're not related to, and we didn't have permission to share their pictures. So you have to educate folks. The good rule to follow there, the last part. If you don't want it in the church bulletin or you wouldn't put it on the church sign, you shouldn't be putting it on Facebook either. Okay? Particularly as members of the body of Christ. The rest of this piece here, if something does happen in your church, if there's an allegation, how do you respond? You have to figure that out. In each county, if some kid comes to you and says, I'm being abused at home, you're a mandatory reporter, not just by law, but for moral and because you're a part of the body of Christ. We want to end the abuse. We want to protect the child. So for moral reasons, we report. And the rule I usually say is make sure you're aware as a church who you call in this county, because it's different in every county. If it's Job and Family Services, it could be Child Protection Agency. I don't know where you sit and what county you're in, but it's different everywhere. And the other rule I always say is the professionals are the ones who you're calling on the phone. So when you call to report, you do what they say. You don't investigate. You don't start asking a lot of questions. You love the kid who just told you they're being abused. But please don't start asking questions and details about it, because court cases against perpetrators get thrown out of court when the defense can be, well, no, it was that counselor or was that staff person or that teacher who put the idea in that kid's head because you asked too many questions. So, okay. I think I'll stop there.